I was 9 years old when my parents bought the house in Ohio. It was a massive, sprawling Victorian-style home built in the late 1800s, sitting on a 2-acre lot at the very edge of a sleepy, decaying Rust Belt town. To my parents, it was a dream fixer-upper. They had spent years saving up, watching home improvement shows, and talking about the day they could finally own a piece of history and restore it to its former glory. To me, from the very first moment our station wagon pulled up the long gravel driveway, it was a nightmare. The house loomed against the gray autumn sky like a jagged tooth. It was a labyrinth of dark, creaking hardwood, peeling floral wallpaper that looked like diseased skin, and sudden, inexplicable drafts that felt like ice-cold hands brushing against the back of your neck. There was a distinct smell to the place, too, a heavy, suffocating mixture of old dust, damp wood, and something metallic, like old pennies left out in the rain. Because the house was so incredibly old, the heating system was a terrifying relic of a bygone era. Instead of modern, sleek baseboards or small, unobtrusive white grates tucked away in the corners of the ceiling, the house was heated by this massive, terrifying, coal-converted furnace sitting in the center of the unfinished stone basement. The furnace looked like a rusted iron monster, squatting in the dark with its network of thick, dusty metal ductwork spiderwebbing outward across the basement ceiling before disappearing up into the bones of the house. It pushed out hot air through gigantic, ornate cast-iron grates set directly into the floors and baseboards of every single room. These grates were heavy, black, and bolted down, featuring intricate, almost Gothic swirling patterns. The gaps in the iron were wide enough for a child to slip their hand through. If you got close enough, you could look down through the heavy iron shafts and see straight down into the dark, filthy metal shafts that plunged straight down into the pitch-black belly of the house. My bedroom was on the second floor, situated at the very end of a long, narrow hallway that never seemed to get enough sunlight, no matter the time of day. My bed was positioned directly across from one of those large cast-iron wall grates. It sat right at the baseboard, a black, rectangular void that stared at me while I slept. It started in the middle of November. The Ohio nights were getting freezing cold, the kind of cold that seeps through single-pane glass and settles deep into your bones. So the ancient furnace in the basement was working overtime. I would lie awake in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the heavy metal of the vents expanding and contracting with the sudden rushes of heat. It was a violent, industrial sound. It sounded like someone dragging a heavy iron hammer against the inside of the walls. Clank, groan, clank. The noises would echo up from the basement, traveling through the hollow shafts and vibrating right into my bedroom. I hated the sound, but in a weird way, it became a comfort. As long as the furnace was banging and clanking, I knew what was making the noise. It was mechanical. It was real. But one night, just a few days before Thanksgiving, the mechanical noises stopped. I was lying in bed, staring into the dark, listening to the rhythmic groaning of the ducts, when the fan from the basement suddenly cut off. It didn't spin down slowly, it just abruptly ceased, plunging the entire house into a heavy, suffocating silence. The sudden lack of noise was deafening. I rolled over, pulling my heavy quilt up past my chin, my eyes adjusting to the faint moonlight filtering through the bare branches of the oak tree outside my window. As I closed my eyes, trying to force myself to sleep, I heard a sound that made my entire body stiffen into a board. It was a voice, a whisper, echoing up through the hollow metal of the cast-iron grate in my wall. "Are you awake?" It sounded like a little boy, maybe around my own age, but his voice was completely hollow, stripped of any warmth or life. It echoed with a strange metallic timbre, as if he were speaking into a tin can from a mile away, deep within the bowels of the earth. I froze, my lungs locked up. My mind immediately began to race, frantically searching for any logical explanation to grasp onto. I convinced myself it was just the wind howling outside, whistling down the chimney and echoing through the ductwork. Or maybe, I thought, it was the sound of my parents' television drifting up from the living room on the first floor, the acoustic layout of the old house playing tricks on my ears. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. I slowly started to relax my grip on the quilt, but a few seconds later, it came again, slightly louder, slightly sharper. "Are you listening?" Tears immediately pricked the corners of my eyes. The sheer, undeniable clarity of the words shattered any rational explanation I had built in my head. There was someone inside the walls. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled out from under the heavy quilt, my bare feet hitting the freezing hardwood floor, and I sprinted out of my room. I ran blindly down the pitch-black, narrow hallway, my shoulders slamming against the doorframe of my parents' bedroom. I burst inside, crying hysterically, shaking the mattress to wake my dad up. I was babbling about a man in the vents, a boy in the walls, someone hiding down in the dark. My dad, groggy and alarmed, threw off the covers. He grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from his nightstand, took my hand, and walked me back down the freezing hallway to my room. He clicked the heavy switch on the flashlight, sending a blinding beam of yellow light sweeping across my floorboards, illuminating the dancing dust motes in the air, before settling on the black cast-iron wall grate. He knelt down, shining the light directly through the thick iron slots, peering deep into the dusty metal shaft. He stayed like that for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in around us. Finally, he stood up, clicked off the flashlight, and sat on the edge of my bed.
He spent 20 minutes explaining acoustics to a terrified 9-year-old. He used his calm, steady dad voice, telling me about how old houses were like giant wooden instruments. He explained that voices carrying from outside, teenagers walking down the street, or even the neighbors 2 houses down could bounce off the brick, echo down the chimney, and travel through the hollow metal ductwork, making it sound like the noise was coming from right inside the room. He told me it was an auditory illusion. He left the hallway light on for me and cracked my door open so a sliver of yellow light fell across my floor. He promised me there was nothing in the walls. I wanted so desperately to believe him, but I didn't sleep a single wink that night. I lay there, my eyes locked on the black rectangle of the grate, waiting for the whisper to return. For a week, nothing happened. The furnace kicked back on the next morning, the familiar clanking and groaning resumed, and the horrific silence was banished. I slowly started to let my guard down. I started to believe my dad's theory about the acoustics. I convinced myself it was just a strange, one-time coincidence. Then came the first week of December. It was a Saturday afternoon. The sky outside was a bleak, bruised purple, threatening snow. The house was relatively warm, and I was sitting on my bedroom floor, completely absorbed in my own world, playing with a set of plastic green army men. I had carefully lined them up across the intricate patterns of the oriental rug, setting up a massive, sprawling battle. I needed reinforcements for the front line. I turned my back to the center of the room for just a moment, crawling a few feet over to my open closet to dig through a plastic bin for a toy transport truck. I was facing away from the vent for maybe 15 seconds. When I turned back around, truck in hand, I stopped. The battlefield was ruined. 3 of my plastic army men, the ones I had placed closest to the wall where the grate was, were missing. I frowned, confused. I hadn't bumped them. I set the truck down and began to look around. I checked under the edges of the rug. I lifted the heavy quilt draped over the side of my bed and looked underneath, scanning the dust bunnies. I checked my own pockets. They were just gone. As I was crawling on my hands and knees near the wall, sweeping my hands over the hardwood floor, I felt it. A sudden, ice-cold draft hit the side of my face. It was significantly colder than the ambient temperature of the room, smelling strongly of old dirt and raw metallic rust. I slowly turned my head, my eyes locking onto the heavy iron grate. Resting on the very edge of the dark metal lip, just barely inside the pitch-black void of the vent, were my 3 plastic army men. They hadn't just been dropped down there. They were lined up perfectly, shoulder to shoulder, standing upright on the thin ledge of iron. And they were all turned around, facing outward, facing me. I scrambled backward, a strangled gasp catching in my throat. I pushed myself across the floor until my back slammed hard against the wooden frame of my bed. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribs I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the toys. Someone, something had reached out, taken them, and set them back up. I stared at the grate for what felt like hours. The house was dead quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to have stopped. Then, out of the absolute pitch-black darkness of the vent shaft, something began to move. Something pale began to press up against the iron slots. First, my mind couldn't make sense of the shapes. It looked like thick white roots pushing up from the dirt. But as it pressed harder against the metal, I realized with a wave of sheer nausea what I was looking at. It was a hand, but it wasn't a normal hand. The fingers were impossibly long, stretching far beyond the proportions of any human being. They looked like bleached spider's legs. The skin was a sickly, translucent white, stretched so tight over the bone, it looked like it might tear. Beneath the flesh, I could see thick, black veins pulsing. The pale flesh was covered in dark, greasy, soot-like stains, as if it had been digging through wet coal. The impossibly long fingers snaked through the wide gaps in the iron grate. As the grip tightened, I heard a sickening sound. Pop, crack, pop. The knuckles popped loudly in the quiet room like breaking twigs. I pressed myself harder against the bed frame, tears streaming down my face, my mouth open in a silent scream. Then, the darkness behind the grate shifted again. A face pressed hard against the iron.
It was the face of a boy, but it was all wrong. The skin was that same dead, translucent white, smeared with black grime. The face looked stretched and distorted, the cheekbones jutting out sharply. But it was the eyes that broke my mind. They were completely hollow. They weren't just dark. They were sunken so deep into the skull, they looked like empty, bottomless craters. There was no light in them, no humanity, just a staring, abyssal void. His jaw unhinged, dropping impossibly low, revealing rows of small, jagged, broken teeth that looked like shattered porcelain. He didn't whisper this time. He let out a sound that I will never, ever forget until the day I die. It wasn't a human noise. It was a high-pitched, vibrating hum. It started low in his chest and rose in pitch until it sounded like a massive swarm of furious hornets trapped inside a metal tin. The sound vibrated through the air, vibrating in my own teeth, making my skull ache. Suddenly, the heavy iron grate began to rattle. The boy grabbed the bars with both of those terrifying, spider-like hands and pulled. The heavy iron, which was bolted deep into the wooden studs of the wall, groaned violently. The metal warped and shifted. He was trying to rip the grate out of the wall. He was trying to get into the room. The screws securing the corners of the grate began to squeak and give way, showering tiny flakes of dry wood and rusted metal onto the floor. The grate bowed outward toward me, the iron shrieking under the immense pressure. The hornet hum grew deafening, filling the entire room. The spell of paralysis finally broke. I found my voice. I screamed at the absolute top of my lungs, a raw, bloody sound of pure terror that tore my throat. Almost instantly,
I heard heavy footsteps thundering up the wooden stairs from the first floor. My dad was running faster than I had ever heard him move. The second my dad reached the landing, the second my bedroom door flew open and his hand slapped the light switch, flooding the room with bright artificial light, the nightmare stopped. The face behind the iron grate vanished. The pale hands let go. The entity retreated back down into the pitch-black drop of the vent shaft with blinding, impossible speed. The horrifying humming sound was snuffed out like a blown candle. The rattling stopped instantly. My dad burst into the room, chest heaving, his eyes wild. He found me curled in a tight fetal position against the side of my bed, my hands clamped over my ears, sobbing so uncontrollably I couldn't catch my breath. He rushed over to me, grabbing me by the shoulders, asking me what happened, asking where I was hurt, but I couldn't speak. I could only raise a shaking, trembling finger and point toward the wall. My dad followed my gaze. When he looked at the vent, he stopped dead in his tracks, the color completely drained from his face. The heavy cast iron grate, a piece of metal nearly half an inch thick, had been bent violently outward. The thick iron bars were warped, bowing into the room, the heavy metal fatigued and stressed. The heavy screws holding it to the wall had been half ripped from the wood, leaving jagged splinters. It looked exactly as if immense, unnatural pressure had been applied from the inside out. He didn't say a word about acoustics this time. He didn't try to rationalize it. He picked me up, carried me down the hall, and my parents moved my bed into their room that very night. I slept wedged between them, with the door locked and all the lights blazing. The next morning, the house felt entirely different. The dream of the fixer-upper was dead. My dad spent the entire morning on the phone. By noon, he hired a specialized commercial HVAC company to come out and inspect the entire duct system of the house. 2 technicians arrived in a heavy-duty van. My dad refused to let me back up to the second floor, keeping me in the kitchen with my mom, but I could hear them working. They went up to my room, removed the ruined grate from the wall, and sent a heavy fiber-optic camera attached to a long, flexible snake deep down into the shafts. They spent 4 hours mapping every inch of the ventilation system, snaking cameras from the basement up and from the bedrooms down. My dad watched the grainy black and white monitor the entire time over the technician's shoulder. He was looking for a raccoon, an opossum, a squatter, anything that could explain what had happened. They found nothing.
The shafts were completely empty. There were no animal nests, no droppings, no structural damage to the metal from a shifting foundation, no signs of forced entry from the outside. The technician stood in our kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag, looking utterly baffled as he explained to my dad that it was physically impossible for an animal to warp cast iron like that. He said it looked like someone had used a hydraulic spreader from the inside of the duct. My dad paid them, locked the deadbolts, and we spent the next week living entirely on the first floor. We slept on the living room couches. My parents spoke in hushed, nervous whispers when they thought I wasn't listening. They started talking about selling the house, about taking a loss, about just getting out. But the final straw, the discovery that officially drove us out of that house forever, came exactly a week later. My dad had taken a few days off work to prepare the house to go back on the market. He was down in the massive stone basement, hauling up old boxes and debris left behind by the previous owners, trying to clean the place up for a real estate photographer. He was clearing out a dark, damp corner near the old coal chute, stacking rotting wooden pallets, when he noticed something strange about the stonework. The foundation wall behind the pallets didn't look like the rest of the basement. The mortar was different, crumbling and relatively new compared to the ancient stone of the house. It was a false wall. Armed with a sledgehammer, my dad broke through the brittle mortar. He knocked away enough stones to reveal a dark, yawning hole. He shined his flashlight inside. He had found an old, sealed-off subcellar. It was a tiny, windowless room carved directly into the earth beneath the house, completely hidden from the main basement. The air that rushed out of the hole smelled exactly like the draft from my bedroom vent. Old dirt, raw metallic rust, and something deeply, inherently foul. My dad immediately called the police. When the officers arrived and widened the hole to get inside, what they found made the local news, though they kept the most horrifying details out of the papers. Inside the freezing, pitch-black subcellar, they found a small, filthy, stained mattress shoved into the corner. Bolted directly into the heavy stone wall above the mattress were heavy, rusted iron chains equipped with ancient padlocks. But that wasn't the worst part. The ceiling of the subcellar was low, made of thick wooden floorboards. The police found hundreds, maybe thousands of deep, frantic scratch marks gouged directly into the wood above the mattress. They looked like they had been made by human fingernails, clawing desperately at the ceiling over years and years. And directly above those scratch marks, hidden between the floor joists, was the main air intake duct for the massive furnace, the duct that fed directly into the sprawling network of vents that pumped air to the rest of the house, the duct that carried the heat and the sound. The police investigated, but the trail was decades cold. The previous owners had died years ago, and the owners before them were lost to county records. Nobody knew who had been kept down there, or for how long, or what had eventually happened to them in the dark. We moved out 3 months later. It took that long to close the sale, and during those 90 days, we never once turned the furnace on. We used portable space heaters and slept in the living room huddled together, listening to the agonizing silence of the house, waiting to hear a hornet's hum that thankfully never came again. I am in my 30s now. I live in a modern apartment building with central air and smooth plastic ceiling vents. But I still cannot sleep in a room with an open air vent near the floor. I physically cannot do it. Wherever I live, I have to push a heavy dresser, a bookshelf, or a solid piece of furniture directly in front of the grates. My friends think it's just a weird, eccentric interior design quirk. I let them think that. I can't tell them the truth. I can't explain to them that I have to block the vents because I know what it sounds like when the metal starts to groan, because I know what the air smells like when something crawls up from the darkest, forgotten places under the earth, because I know exactly what it looks like when something that has been trapped in the dark for a very, very long time decides it wants to play.
When I was 12 years old, growing up in the late 90s, my older brother Mark and I were the absolute definition of latchkey kids. It was a different era back then, a time before cell phones, GPS tracking apps, and helicopter parenting. Both of my parents worked full-time, demanding jobs in downtown Atlanta, commuting over an hour each way. So from the moment school let out for the summer until the second week of August, Mark and I were basically left entirely to our own devices from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night. Our parents had exactly one rule, and it was the golden rule of the 90s. Be inside the house before the streetlights buzzed on. Aside from that, our time was our own. We survived on frozen pizzas, tap water from the garden hose, and whatever entertainment we could wring out of our immediate surroundings. We lived in a newly developed, sprawling subdivision in northern Georgia. The neighborhood was one of those cookie-cutter developments that had seemingly been carved forcefully out of the wilderness overnight. We had smooth, freshly paved blacktop streets, neat little squares aside for lawns, and identical mailboxes. But the illusion of total suburban taming was just that, an illusion. The neighborhood was surrounded on 3 sides by deep, incredibly dense, unlogged woods that the local kids had dubbed Miller's Creek. The woods were a stark, intimidating contrast to the manicured lawns of our subdivision. The tree line pressed right up against the backyards of the houses on the outer ring, a towering wall of ancient oak, towering Georgia pines and weeping willows choking on thick, gray Spanish moss. The canopy was so incredibly dense that even at high noon, the forest floor was cast in a perpetual murky twilight. And somewhere deep inside that twilight, about a mile past the edge of the trees, was the creek itself. It was a slow-moving, murky stretch of black water that smelled faintly of rotten leaves and iron. It was late July, and Georgia was suffering through an oppressive, suffocating heat wave. The kind of heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and distorts the air, making it physically difficult to draw a full breath. The humidity was sitting at nearly 90%, hanging in the air like a wet, hot towel. Mark, who was 14 and constantly looking for ways to prove his bravery, had decided that we were going to map the creek. We had spent the entire morning and early afternoon exploring a completely new, uncharted section of the woods that we hadn't dared venture into before. We were armed with heavy, fallen branches, hacking our way through the thick underbrush, tearing our way through walls of briars and spider webs. We were sweating straight through our cotton t-shirts. Our shins were covered in scratches and angry red mosquito bites, and our cheap canvas sneakers were caked in thick black mud. We had been walking for hours, pushing deeper and deeper into the suffocating green gloom. The sounds of the subdivision, the distant hum of lawnmowers, the bark of neighborhood dogs had faded away hours ago. Out here, the only sounds were the deafening rhythmic screaming of the cicadas and the crunch of our own boots snapping dead twigs. That was when we stumbled upon something incredibly, violently out of place. We had just pushed our way through a particularly dense thicket of overgrown razor-sharp thorn bushes when the ground suddenly dropped away. We found ourselves standing at the edge of a massive, naturally formed ravine. The dirt embankments were steep and slick with moss. But it wasn't the ravine that caught our attention. It was what was sitting at the very bottom of it. Embedded deep into the earth, half swallowed by the muddy bank and tangled roots, was a massive concrete storm drain. This made absolutely no sense. I knew what the subdivision's drainage system looked like. It consisted of modern, corrugulated metal pipes that emptied into a spillway miles away near the highway. This pipe was not from our neighborhood. It was huge, at least 6 feet in diameter, easily tall enough for a full-grown man to stand inside without having to duck his head. The concrete was ancient, crumbling, and stained a sickly dark green. Thick layers of algae and moss clung to the porous surface, and the lip of the pipe was jagged and cracked as if it had been abandoned for a century. It was expelling a slow, steady trickle of foul-smelling, stagnant, rust-colored water that bled into the muddy floor of the ravine before slowly winding its way toward Miller's Creek. Being stupid, fearless boys, we were immediately fascinated by the anomaly. Mark didn't even hesitate. He slid down the steep, muddy embankment on the heels of his sneakers, surfing the dirt until he hit the bottom. I followed a moment later, far more cautiously, grabbing onto exposed tree roots to keep from falling. We stood shoulder to shoulder at the yawning entrance of the dark tunnel. The immediate contrast in temperature was jarring. The air bleeding out of the open mouth of the pipe was freezing cold. It smelled like wet stone, ozone, and something sickly sweet like decaying meat hidden under dirt. It was easily 15 degrees colder standing right in front of it, raising goosebumps on my sweat-slicked arms. Mark said, "I dare you to go in," his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He bent down, picked up a jagged rock from the mud, and chucked it deep into the darkness of the pipe. We stood in silence, waiting. Several seconds passed before we heard it land. Splash! It echoed softly, bouncing off the damp concrete walls, sounding impossibly far away. "No way," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I pulled my cheap plastic yellow flashlight out of my pocket and clicked it on. I shined a weak, dying beam into the pipe. The light barely penetrated the gloom,
It illuminated maybe 10 feet of wet, slimy concrete walls before being completely swallowed by the suffocating darkness. The tunnel didn't go straight. It curved slightly to the left, disappearing into the earth so you couldn't see where it ended or what might be waiting around the bend. "Don't be a baby," Mark scoffed, taking a half step forward into the shallow water pooling at the entrance. "It's just an old sewer, probably connects to the old mill down by the—" Suddenly, a voice echoed out from deep within the concrete tunnel. "Mark? David?" We both froze instantly. Our breath hitched in our throats. The flashlight in my hand shook, sending the yellow beam dancing erratically across the mossy ceiling of the pipe. It was our mother's voice. It didn't make any sense. The impossibility of it hit my 12-year-old brain like a physical blow. Our mom was an accountant. She was currently sitting at a desk in a high-rise building 40 miles away in the bustling heart of downtown Atlanta. She was wearing a pantsuit. She wouldn't be off work until another 4 hours. She wouldn't be home until dinner time, and she certainly wouldn't be standing deep inside an abandoned, rotten storm drain in the middle of a muddy ravine in Miller's Creek. "Boys, come here, please. I need help." Her voice sounded perfectly clear, echoing off the damp concrete walls and drifting out into the humid summer air. And as I listened, a wave of profound, icy sickness washed over me. There was something deeply, fundamentally wrong with the cadence of the words.
It was completely flat. It was entirely devoid of any natural human emotion, inflection, or urgency. When a mother calls out for her children in the woods, there's a specific tone: worry, annoyance, relief. This had none of that. It was entirely monotone. Worse still, it sounded tinny. It sounded exactly like a recording of our mother's voice being played through a cheap, broken cassette deck at the bottom of a well. Mark looked over at me. All the color had completely drained from his face, leaving his freckles standing out in stark relief against his pale skin. He swallowed hard. "Mom?" he called out, his voice cracking, pitching up in tentative fear. He took a tiny half-step backward out of the shallow water. The response from the dark was immediate. There was no hesitation, no natural pause for thought. "Mark? David? Boys? Come here, please. I need help." It was the exact same phrase, the exact same pitch, the exact same flat, dead delivery. But what terrified me the most was the timing. The pause between David and boys was identical down to the microsecond. It didn't answer Mark's question. It didn't acknowledge that he had spoken at all. It just repeated the audio clip, perfectly mimicking the sound it had produced a moment before. A visceral, primal sense of absolute dread washed over me. It was an ancient, evolutionary alarm bell in the deepest part of my brain. Every single instinct I had screamed at me that whatever was standing just around the dark curve of that concrete pipe was not human. It did not have our mother's face. It was an anglerfish dangling a familiar light in the dark, and it was trying to lure us into its jaws. Then we heard the splashing. It started from deep within the tunnel, past the curve where the flashlight beam couldn't reach. It was the sound of heavy, wet footsteps wading through the knee-deep, stagnant water inside the pipe, moving steadily towards us. Splash, drag, splash, drag. It was heavy, lumbering, and completely wrong. It didn't sound like two human feet walking. It sounded like something massive, dragging its weight through the muck, pulling itself forward. Splash, drag. It was getting faster. It was getting closer. "Run," Mark whispered, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in him before. He didn't need to tell me twice. We turned and scrambled blindly up the muddy walls of the ravine. Panic completely consumed us. We were slipping and sliding in the wet earth, our hands grasping desperately at thorny vines, ripping our skin open without even feeling the pain. I lost my grip, sliding backwards, and Mark grabbed me by the collar of my shirt, violently hauling me up over the lip of the embankment. We hit the forest floor and ran. We didn't care about the branches whipping our faces. We didn't care about the briars tearing at our jeans. We ran with the kind of frantic, desperate speed that is only fueled by the absolute certainty that something is right behind you, reaching out to grab your shoulder. The woods blurred around us. My lungs burned, tasting like copper and hot dust. We tore through the underbrush, not daring to look back, guided only by the faint, distant sunlight filtering through the edge of the canopy. We didn't stop running until we broke through the tree line and hit the blistering hot asphalt of our subdivision. We collapsed onto the perfectly manicured front lawn of the nearest house, gasping for air, our chests heaving, coughing up saliva. We lay there on our backs, staring up at the blinding blue summer sky, completely covered in mud, sweat, and blood from the briar scratches. Eventually, we sat up and looked back at the tree line. The woods stood silent and still. The cicadas were still buzzing. The shadows between the trees were deep and impenetrable. Nothing had followed us out. Whatever had been in that pipe had stayed in the dark. Then, when Mom got home that night, pulling her sedan into the driveway right at 6 o'clock, we didn't say a word. We sat at the kitchen table, eating our macaroni and cheese in complete silence, exchanging terrified, knowing glances. We knew she wouldn't believe us. We were kids with wild imaginations. She would just assume we were making up ghost stories to scare each other, and worse, she'd probably ground us for the rest of the summer for wandering so dangerously deep into Miller's Creek. 2 weeks passed. The oppressive heat wave continued, baking the neighborhood in a shimmering haze. Mark and I completely changed our routine. We avoided the woods entirely. We didn't even go near the backyards that bordered the tree line. Instead, we spent our days riding our bikes on the paved streets, sticking strictly to the cul-de-sacs, always in the direct, blinding sunlight. As the days ticked by, the immediate terror began to fade into a dull, manageable ache. The human mind is incredibly adept at rationalizing trauma, especially when you're a kid. By the end of the second week, sitting in the safety of my air-conditioned living room watching cartoons, I had almost managed to convince myself that we had imagined the whole thing. I told myself it was just a strange echo, or maybe it was a cruel prank by some of the older high school teenagers in the neighborhood who had seen us walking and hid in the pipe with a tape recorder. It was a lie, but it was a lie I desperately needed to believe so I could sleep at night. Then came a Friday night in mid-August. The heat wave finally broke in the most violent way possible. A massive, swirling summer storm rolled in over the Georgia hills. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and the wind howled through the subdivision, violently bending the young trees in the front yards.
It was completely flat. It was entirely devoid of any natural human emotion, inflection, or urgency. When a mother calls out for her children in the woods, there's a specific tone: worry, annoyance, relief. This had none of that. It was entirely monotone. Worse still, it sounded tinny. It sounded exactly like a recording of our mother's voice being played through a cheap, broken cassette deck at the bottom of a well. Mark looked over at me. All the color had completely drained from his face, leaving his freckles standing out in stark relief against his pale skin. He swallowed hard. "Mom?" he called out, his voice cracking, pitching up in tentative fear. He took a tiny half-step backward out of the shallow water. The response from the dark was immediate. There was no hesitation, no natural pause for thought. "Mark? David? Boys? Come here, please. I need help." It was the exact same phrase, the exact same pitch, the exact same flat, dead delivery. But what terrified me the most was the timing. The pause between David and boys was identical down to the microsecond.
It didn't answer Mark's question. It didn't acknowledge that he had spoken at all. It just repeated the audio clip, perfectly mimicking the sound it had produced a moment before. A visceral, primal sense of absolute dread washed over me. It was an ancient, evolutionary alarm bell in the deepest part of my brain. Every single instinct I had screamed at me that whatever was standing just around the dark curve of that concrete pipe was not human. It did not have our mother's face. It was an anglerfish dangling a familiar light in the dark, and it was trying to lure us into its jaws. Then we heard the splashing. It started from deep within the tunnel, past the curve where the flashlight beam couldn't reach. It was the sound of heavy, wet footsteps wading through the knee-deep, stagnant water inside the pipe, moving steadily towards us. Splash, drag, splash, drag. It was heavy, lumbering, and completely wrong. It didn't sound like two human feet walking. It sounded like something massive, dragging its weight through the muck, pulling itself forward. Splash, drag. It was getting faster. It was getting closer. "Run," Mark whispered, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in him before. He didn't need to tell me twice. We turned and scrambled blindly up the muddy walls of the ravine. Panic completely consumed us. We were slipping and sliding in the wet earth, our hands grasping desperately at thorny vines, ripping our skin open without even feeling the pain. I lost my grip, sliding backwards, and Mark grabbed me by the collar of my shirt, violently hauling me up over the lip of the embankment. We hit the forest floor and ran. We didn't care about the branches whipping our faces. We didn't care about the briars tearing at our jeans. We ran with the kind of frantic, desperate speed that is only fueled by the absolute certainty that something is right behind you, reaching out to grab your shoulder. The woods blurred around us. My lungs burned, tasting like copper and hot dust. We tore through the underbrush, not daring to look back, guided only by the faint, distant sunlight filtering through the edge of the canopy. We didn't stop running until we broke through the tree line and hit the blistering hot asphalt of our subdivision. We collapsed onto the perfectly manicured front lawn of the nearest house, gasping for air, our chests heaving, coughing up saliva. We lay there on our backs, staring up at the blinding blue summer sky, completely covered in mud, sweat, and blood from the briar scratches. Eventually, we sat up and looked back at the tree line. The woods stood silent and still. The cicadas were still buzzing. The shadows between the trees were deep and impenetrable. Nothing had followed us out. Whatever had been in that pipe had stayed in the dark. Then, when Mom got home that night, pulling her sedan into the driveway right at 6 o'clock, we didn't say a word. We sat at the kitchen table, eating our macaroni and cheese in complete silence, exchanging terrified, knowing glances. We knew she wouldn't believe us. We were kids with wild imaginations. She would just assume we were making up ghost stories to scare each other. And worse, she'd probably ground us for the rest of the summer for wandering so dangerously deep into Miller's Creek. 2 weeks passed. The oppressive heat wave continued, baking the neighborhood in a shimmering haze. Mark and I completely changed our routine. We avoided the woods entirely. We didn't even go near the backyards that bordered the tree line. Instead, we spent our days riding our bikes on the paved streets, sticking strictly to the cul-de-sacs, always in the direct, blinding sunlight. As the days ticked by, the immediate terror began to fade into a dull, manageable ache. The human mind is incredibly adept at rationalizing trauma, especially when you're a kid. By the end of the second week, sitting in the safety of my air-conditioned living room watching cartoons, I had almost managed to convince myself that we had imagined the whole thing. I told myself it was just a strange echo, or maybe it was a cruel prank by some of the older high school teenagers in the neighborhood who had seen us walking and hid in the pipe with a tape recorder. It was a lie, but it was a lie I desperately needed to believe so I could sleep at night. Then came a Friday night in mid-August. The heat wave finally broke in the most violent way possible. A massive, swirling summer storm rolled in over the Georgia hills. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and the wind howled through the subdivision, violently bending the young trees in the front yards.
Around 10, a brilliant flash of lightning struck a nearby transformer. The thunderclap was deafening, shaking the foundation of the house, and instantly the power to our entire street was knocked out. The house plunged into absolute darkness. My parents, exhausted from a long work week, just told us to go to bed early. They lit a few candles downstairs, made sure the doors were locked, and retreated to their master bedroom on the first floor. Mark and I shared a bedroom on the second floor, right at the back of the house. Our window overlooked the backyard, and beyond the short wooden fence, the sprawling, dark expanse of Miller's Creek. I was lying in bed, wrapped tightly in my sheets, despite the stifling, unair-conditioned heat of the room. The storm outside was completely chaotic. The rain was lashing violently against the glass window pane in heavy, relentless sheets. The wind screamed around the eaves of the roof. The only light in the room came from the sporadic, strobing flashes of lightning that temporarily illuminated our posters and dressers in sharp, jagged monochrome. Around 2 a.m., the storm began to settle into a steady, torrential downpour. The thunder was distant now, a low rumble on the horizon. The house was dead quiet inside. That was when I woke up. I don't know what pulled me out of sleep, but my eyes snapped open, staring at the dark ceiling. I rolled over, looking across the room. I immediately noticed two things. First, Mark was already awake. He was sitting bolt upright in his bed, the sheets pooled around his waist. He wasn't moving. He was staring completely, utterly wide-eyed at our bedroom window. Second, I heard the sound that had woken me. It was coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. It was a distinct, rhythmic sound. It wasn't a tree branch scraping against the glass in the wind. It wasn't a heavy raindrop. It was deliberate. It sounded exactly like a thick fingernail clicking against the pane. My blood ran completely cold. The rationalization I had built up over the last 2 weeks instantly shattered. Our bedroom was on the second story of the house. The exterior wall of our room was completely flat aluminum siding. There was no balcony, there wasn't an awning, there wasn't even a tall tree near the window that someone could climb. There was just a straight, sheer 20-foot drop to the wet grass of the backyard below. There was absolutely no physical way anything or anyone could be outside that window. I slowly sat up, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, joining Mark in staring at the glass. The tapping came again, a little louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. It was low on the glass, positioned right near the bottom sill. Suddenly, a brilliant fork of lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the backyard in a blinding white strobe for a fraction of a second. In that split second of harsh light, through the heavy, distorting sheets of rain washing down the glass, I saw it. Pressed flat on the outside of our second-story window was a hand. It was pale, sickly white, and impossibly large. The fingers were elongated, stretching far beyond the proportions of a human hand, terminating in sharp, hardened points. It looked like the hand of a drowned corpse, swollen and dead, gripping the bottom of the windowsill. It was supporting an immense, unseen weight hanging directly below it in the dark. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I was completely paralyzed. Then, cutting through the roaring sound of the pouring rain, filtering muffled but unmistakably through the thick pane of double-paned glass, we heard the voice. "Mark? David?
"Boys, come here, please. I need help." It was the same flat, recorded, tinny voice. It was her voice, and it was right outside the glass. Mark didn't say a word. He didn't scream. He just lunged across the narrow space between our beds and grabbed my arm. His grip was so incredibly tight, driven by pure, unadulterated adrenaline, that he left deep purple bruises shaped like his fingers on my bicep that lasted for weeks.
We bolted from the room. We didn't look back. We threw the bedroom door open, scrambled frantically down the darkened wooden stairs, practically falling over each other in our haste, and burst into our parents' bedroom on the first floor. We woke them up in a hysterical panic, crying, shaking, and babbling about someone outside the window. My dad, groggy and alarmed, grabbed a heavy Maglite flashlight and a baseball bat from the closet. He searched the entire house, making sure every deadbolt was thrown, every window was locked. He even shined his light out into the backyard through the sliding glass doors, sweeping the beam across the rain-soaked grass. He saw nothing. He told us it was just the storm playing tricks on us, just the house settling in the wind. But he let us stay. Mark and I grabbed spare blankets from the linen closet and slept on the floor of our parents' bedroom, wedged between their bed and the wall, terrified out of our minds, waiting for the doorknob to slowly turn. It never did. The next morning, the power was finally restored. The storm had completely cleared, leaving behind a crisp, washed-out blue sky and a neighborhood dripping with rainwater. The sun was shining, the birds were singing. It felt like an insulting, mundane morning after a night of pure horror. My dad, still a little annoyed about being woken up in the middle of the night, went outside to check the gutters for debris and assess any wind damage to the roof. Mark and I followed him out the back door, stepping onto the wet grass, our hearts lodged firmly in our throats. We walked around to the back of the house and looked up at our second-story bedroom window. My dad stopped walking. The annoyance vanished from his face, replaced by a deep, furrowed confusion. The pale yellow aluminum siding of the house, directly beneath our bedroom window, was destroyed. It was covered in deep, parallel, gouged scratch marks. The metal was peeled back and shredded, exposing the wooden framing underneath. The marks started near the ground and tracked straight up the sheer side of the house, stopping right below the windowsill. It looked exactly as if something incredibly heavy, armed with massive, iron-hard claws, had violently hauled its own weight up the side of the house, digging into the siding for purchase. But it was what was on the ground that finally broke my dad's skepticism. Pressed deep into the soft, rain-soaked mud of the flower bed directly beneath the window were footprints. They weren't human shoes. They didn't even look remotely human. They were massive, easily twice the size of my dad's work boots. They looked like elongated bare feet, but they had far too many toes, splayed out wide, sinking inches deep into the earth under immense weight. My dad didn't say anything. He just stared at the gouges on the wall and then down at the mud. We followed the tracks. The bizarre, multi-toed footprints led heavily out of the flower bed, dragging across the wet grass of our backyard. They crossed the property line, went down the paved street for a few yards, and then veered sharply, disappearing directly into the dense, impenetrable tree line of Miller's Creek, heading straight back toward the dark water. My dad called the police that morning. 2 officers came out, took photos of the siding, documented the footprints, and filed a report about an unidentified animal wandering into the subdivision. They suggested a bear, but even they didn't sound convinced when they looked at the sheer impossibility of the tracks. Nothing ever came of it. Whatever it was, it had retreated back to its ancient concrete pipe, back into the dark where it belonged. We never went back into those woods, not once. Even when we got older and the other teenagers threw bonfires by the creek, Mark and I stayed firmly in the subdivision under the comforting glow of the amber streetlights. I live in another state now. I'm a grown man with a family of my own.
I have a security system on my house, and I make sure all the windows are locked before the sun goes down. And to this day, nearly 25 years later, whenever my mother calls me on the phone, I absolutely refuse to say a word to her until she answers a very specific question. A question only she and absolutely no one else in the world would know the answer to. Because I know that somewhere out there, hidden deep in the damp, rotting dark, there are things that can perfectly mimic the people you love, and they are just waiting for you to answer them back.
I was 15 years old, navigating that awkward, frustrating purgatory between childhood and adulthood, which essentially meant I was the designated, unpaid babysitter for my 3-year-old sister, Lily. My parents were both dedicated, high-strung trauma surgeons who worked brutal, unforgiving on-call shifts at one of the busiest hospitals in the city. Because of their grueling schedules, I spent the vast majority of my weekends playing the role of a surrogate parent. My Friday and Saturday nights consisted of heating up frozen macaroni and cheese, watching animated movies until the DVD menus looped endlessly, and going through the painstaking hour-long routine of putting an energetic toddler to bed. We lived in a massive, ultra-modern, newly constructed house in the sprawling suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. It was a very affluent, meticulously manicured neighborhood. It was the kind of gated community that boasted neighborhood watches, private security patrols, and absolutely zero history of violent crime. When you're 15, living in a fortress of stucco and glass, you don't really spend your time worrying about the supernatural. You don't think about monsters. You think about passing your algebra tests, playing video games, and relishing the rare moments when you get the entire house to yourself so you can stay up past midnight. But the universe has an incredibly funny, cruel way of completely stripping away your logic, your comfort, and your sense of security when you find yourself utterly, completely alone in the dark. It was a Saturday night in late October. The brutal Arizona summer heat had finally broken, leaving the desert nights crisp, cool, and perfectly still. My parents were attending a mandatory weekend-long medical conference at a luxury resort downtown and weren't expected back until sometime late Sunday morning. They had kissed us goodbye around 3 in the afternoon, leaving emergency cash on the kitchen island and a list of contact numbers magnetized to the fridge. The evening had gone exactly according to script. I had given Lily her bath, wrestling her into her favorite fleece pajamas, read her 2 picture books, and finally tucked her into her heavy wooden crib in the nursery, situated at the far end of the second-floor hallway. To monitor her from downstairs, we used this incredibly old, bulky, yellowing plastic baby monitor from the early 2000s. It had originally belonged to an older cousin and been passed down to us. In an era where everyone was upgrading to high-definition video monitors with night vision and Wi-Fi connectivity, my parents, despite their income, were remarkably frugal about certain things and refused to buy a new one. It wasn't a video monitor, it was just a primitive 2-way radio system equipped with a thick, rubbery antenna and a physical slider switch that let you choose between 4 different frequency channels, A, B, C, and D. It was notoriously finicky, highly prone to picking up bursts of white noise, static, or even interference from our neighbors' older cordless landline phones, but it did the job well enough. Around 11 p.m., the house had settled into that deep, heavy silence that only large, empty houses can produce. I was sitting downstairs on the plush living room couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching a late-night comedy show on the television with the volume turned down low so I wouldn't wake my sister. The receiver unit of the baby monitor was sitting directly in front of me on the glass coffee table, set to channel A. For the last 2 hours, the only sound coming through the cheap, tinny speaker was the soft, rhythmic sound of Lily breathing, accompanied by the gentle, white noise hum of the oscillating fan sweeping back and forth in the corner of her bedroom. It was peaceful. It was profoundly normal. Then the monitor crackled loudly. Hiss, pop,
A sudden sharp burst of harsh white noise erupted from the speaker. I jumped slightly, startled by the sudden intrusion of sound in the living room. I looked down at the plastic device. The static hissed violently for a few excruciating seconds, the red LED volume indicator lights spiking all the way to the top, before it suddenly popped again and cleared up. But the ambient audio had changed. The comforting, steady hum of Lily's fan was completely gone. The soft, rhythmic rise and fall of her sleeping breaths had vanished. Instead, I heard breathing that was incredibly, uncomfortably close to the microphone. It was heavy, it was wet, it was ragged. It sounded like a large animal or a very sick person struggling to draw air through a throat thick with mucus. Every inhalation was a wet, struggling rasp, and every exhalation was a shuddering, guttural wheeze. It sounded exactly like someone drowning in their own fluids, standing mere inches away from the transmitter. I froze, a sudden icy knot forming in the pit of my stomach. I reached out and grabbed the receiver off the coffee table, my palms suddenly slick with cold sweat. I brought the speaker close to my face. "Hello?" I whispered, pressing my thumb nervously against the plastic casing near the speaker grill. Through the monitor, the wet breathing paused. Then I heard a voice. It was a man's voice, incredibly deep, gravelly, and raspy, vibrating the plastic in my hand. He wasn't speaking English. He was speaking in a fast, rhythmic, rolling cadence. The syllables were sharp, guttural, and ancient. It sounded like Latin, or maybe something older, something entirely forgotten by the modern world. It was a chant, but it was completely devoid of any human emotion. There was no anger, no sadness, no joy, just a flat, relentless, driving recitation of impossible words, punctuated by that horrific, wet wheezing. My heart instantly started hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My mind, desperate to protect me from the paralyzing fear welling up inside my chest, immediately began throwing out logical life rafts. "It's just interference," I told myself frantically. "The monitor's old. It picked up a neighboring frequency. It's a trucker on a CB radio driving past on the highway a few miles over. It's some teenager next door watching a late-night horror movie with the volume cranked up. We're pulling a prank on a shortwave radio." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the plastic. I reached out with my index finger, pressed it against the rigid plastic slider on the side of the receiver, and pushed it down with a hard, definitive click, switching the frequency from channel A to channel B. Crackle. Then, absolute silence. A few seconds later, the familiar, gentle hum of Lily's bedroom fan drifted softly through the speaker. A moment after that, the faint, high-pitched, rhythmic sound of her tiny breaths returned. I let out a massive, shuddering sigh of pure relief, my shoulders slumping. I dropped my head back against the couch cushions, closing my eyes and rubbing my temples. It was just a crossed signal, just a terrifying, perfectly timed technological glitch, nothing more. I set the monitor back down on the glass coffee table, pulling my blanket a little tighter around my shoulders, trying to focus my attention back on the glowing screen of the television to calm my racing heart. 5 minutes passed. The house was quiet again. Then, lying completely untouched in the center of the glass coffee table, the baby monitor physically moved. I watched it happen. I watched the rigid plastic slider switch on the side of the device physically snap upwards, entirely on its own accord. Click. It moved from channel B straight back up to channel A. The heavy, wet, ragged breathing resumed instantly, blasting out of the speaker at maximum volume. Wheeze, gasp, wheeze. I stared at the plastic device in absolute mind-shattering horror. The air in my lungs turned to lead. The man's voice returned, but he wasn't chanting in a foreign ancient language anymore. He was speaking perfectly clear, unaccented English. I am right beside her." The voice didn't just come out of the speaker, it seemed to echo out of the device, filling the quiet, empty living room, vibrating in my own teeth. I didn't think. Instinct completely overrode my terror. The primal protective surge of adrenaline hit my bloodstream like a freight train. I dropped the blanket, kicked the coffee table out of the way, and sprinted. I flew across the living room, hit the hardwood stairs barefoot, and tore upwards, taking the steps 2 and 3 at a time. I vaulted over the landing, sprinted down the long, dark second-floor hallway, and practically threw my entire body weight against the heavy wooden door of the nursery. I burst into the room and immediately slammed the palm of my hand against the wall dimmer switch, pushing it all the way to the top, flooding the room with blinding, harsh overhead light. I stood in the doorway, chest heaving, fists clenched, ready to fight for my sister's life. The room was completely, utterly empty. Lily was sound asleep in her crib, curled up on her side beneath her pink blanket, completely undisturbed. She was clutching her frayed stuffed rabbit to her chest, breathing softly, totally oblivious to the nightmare unfolding around her. I didn't stop. I tore the room apart. I dropped to my knees and checked under the heavy wooden crib. Nothing. I threw open the bifold closet doors, pushing her tiny hanging clothes aside. Empty. I ripped back the heavy blackout curtains covering the window. The glass was intact, the thick metal locking latch securely fastened from the inside. There was absolutely nowhere for a grown man to hide in that room. I stood in the center of the nursery, panting, feeling a massive, dizzying wave of profound confusion wash over me. I was in the room. There was no one here. The house was dead silent. I looked over at the changing table dresser sitting against the far wall. The baby monitor transmitter, the identical twin to the unit sitting downstairs, was sitting right where I had left it. The little red LED light on its face was glowing brightly, indicating that it was actively transmitting audio. I felt a sudden desperate urge to turn the machine off, to pull the plug from the wall and sever the connection to whatever terrible frequency it had tapped into. I walked slowly across the plush carpet toward the dresser. As I reached my hand out to flip the power switch on the side of the transmitter, the atmosphere inside the nursery violently shifted. A freezing, unnatural cold swept through the room in an instant. It wasn't the ambient cooling of the air conditioning. It was a localized, bone-deep plunge in temperature. It dropped so fast and so severely that the moisture in the room instantly condensed. When I exhaled, a thick plume of white vapor plumed from my lips. Then, right next to my left ear, hovering directly in the empty, brightly lit space between where I stood and the bars of Lily's crib, I heard it. Wheeze. Gasp. The heavy, wet, ragged breathing. I froze instantly. My hand hovered just inches above the plastic monitor on the dresser. Every single hair on my arms, neck, and back stood straight up. Every alarm bell in my primitive brain was screaming, begging me to run. "Look up," the deep, raspy voice whispered. The sound didn't come through the plastic speaker of the monitor. The audio wasn't compressed or tinny. It was real. The voice vibrated the air directly behind my head, so close I could feel the displacement of the freezing air against the nape of my neck. I didn't want to do it. I wanted to close my eyes, grab my sister, and run blindly into the hall. But my body moved without my permission. With agonizing, terrifying slowness, I tilted my head back and looked up at the smooth drywall ceiling directly above Lily's crib. Clinging to the ceiling, suspended exactly 8 feet above my sleeping baby sister, was a man. He was clinging to the flat drywall, all 4 of his abnormally long, multi-jointed limbs splayed out wide like a massive, pale spider. He had no clothes on. His skin was the color of slate, a rotting, sickly, translucent gray that looked like it had been submerged in freezing water for weeks. Dark, thick veins pulsed visibly beneath the surface of his skin. But it was his head that broke my mind. His neck was snapped and twisted at an impossible, unnatural 90-degree angle, allowing his head to hang limply, staring directly straight down at the crib. His eyes were open wide, bulging from their sockets, completely white without a trace of iris or pupil. And he was smiling. His lips were peeled back in a grotesque, exaggerated rictus grin that stretched far past the natural limits of a human jaw, revealing row after row of sharp, jagged, jet-black teeth that looked like decaying shards of obsidian. As I stared up at him in absolute paralysis, he unhinged his jaw further. The wet, ragged breathing, the terrible, drowning sound poured directly out of his throat. I didn't scream. I knew if I screamed, I would die. I lunged forward, throwing my arms into the crib. I grabbed Lily by the fabric of her pajamas and hauled her up against my chest so violently I woke her up. She immediately began to cry, confused and terrified, but I didn't care. I clamped my hand protectively over the back of her head, turned on my heel, and ran. I ran faster than I have ever run in my entire life. I tore out of the nursery, down the second-floor hallway, and practically threw myself down the wooden stairs, nearly breaking my ankle on the landing. I hit the front door, fumbled frantically with the deadbolt, ripped it open, and exploded out into the cold, dark street. I was barefoot, wearing only a t-shirt and shorts, clutching my crying sister to my chest, sprinting down the asphalt of our pristine subdivision. I ran straight to the house of our nearest neighbor, a retired couple, and pounded my bloody fists against their heavy wooden door until they woke up, turned on their porch light, and let us in. They called the police immediately. 2 squad cars arrived within 10 minutes. 4 heavily armed officers cleared our massive house top to bottom. They searched every closet, every bathroom, the attic, and the garage. They found absolutely nothing. There were no signs of forced entry, the windows were still locked, the alarm system was untampered with, nothing in the house was out of place, the baby monitor in the nursery was still sitting on the dresser, its red light glowing steadily. When my parents rushed home at 2 in the morning, panicked and exhausted, they spoke to the police. The official conclusion was that I, being a stressed 15-year-old teenager with too much responsibility, had suffered a severe, incredibly vivid panic attack brought on by sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination, which had triggered a temporary visual and auditory hallucination. My parents believed the police. They sent me to an expensive cognitive behavioral therapist for over a year to deal with my night terrors and anxiety. I sat on plush couches and talked about stress and coping mechanisms. I nodded, I agreed with the doctor, and I played the part of the healing teenager. But I know what I saw. I know what the air felt like when the temperature dropped. I know what that ragged breath sounded like. We moved out of that sprawling modern house a year later, relocating to a different suburb closer to my parents' hospital. I'm an adult now, living on my own, but to this very day, if I visit a friend or family member who has just had a child, I absolutely refuse to be in the same room as a baby monitor. If I see one sitting on a counter, I have to walk outside, because I know the truth. I know that sometimes those cheap little plastic boxes aren't just picking up interference from a neighbor's phone. Sometimes they are picking up the things that hide in the dark, the things that cling to the spaces we refuse to look at, just waiting for you to listen.
Sleepovers are supposed to be a cornerstone of childhood. They're a universal rite of passage. You pack an oversized duffel bag with a sleeping bag and pajamas, you stay up way past your bedtime, you eat your weight in junk food, and you tell poorly constructed ghost stories in the dark until you manage to scare yourselves to sleep. It's supposed to be innocent. But when I was 11 years old, I went to a sleepover that fundamentally shattered my perception of reality, broke my understanding of how the world is supposed to work, and left me with a deep, paralyzing, lifelong fear of the dark. My best friend in the 6th grade was a girl named Chloe. She had just moved to our small, perpetually overcast town in Oregon right at the beginning of the school year. Oregon in late November is a bleak place. The skies are a constant, bruised shade of gray, and the dampness in the air is the kind that seeps through your winter coat and settles deep into your bones. Chloe was quiet, pale, and kept mostly to herself, which naturally drew me to her. We bonded over a shared love of drawing and reading thick fantasy paperbacks in the back corner of the school library. Her family had recently bought a massive, deeply isolated farmhouse about 10 miles outside of the city limits. To get there, you had to drive past the edge of town, navigate a labyrinth of winding, unpaved logging roads, and cross a rickety wooden bridge over a swollen river. The house was completely surrounded by acres of dark, silent, fallow farmland and towering, impossibly thick pine forests that seemed to press in on the property from all sides. It was a Friday night in late November. The weather that evening was absolutely miserable, a driving, freezing rain mixed with a heavy, rolling fog that severely limited visibility to just a few feet in front of the car headlights. My mom drove me out there, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she carefully navigated the muddy gravel driveway. When the farmhouse finally loomed out of the fog, it looked less like a home and more like a massive, rotting wooden tooth jutting out of the earth. It was a looming Victorian-style structure, painted appealing, faded gray with narrow, staring windows. My mom didn't come inside. She just kissed my forehead, told me to behave, and watched me run up the porch steps through the freezing rain. The moment I stepped through the heavy oak front door, I felt deeply, inherently uncomfortable. It wasn't just the chill of the house, though it was drafty and freezing. It was the atmosphere. Chloe's parents were odd. There is no other way to describe them. They were incredibly quiet, moving around the large, shadowy house with an almost robotic stiffness. When Chloe introduced me, Mr. and Mrs. Miller didn't say a word. They just stood shoulder to shoulder in the dimly lit foyer, staring down at me and offered identical, polite, completely empty smiles. Their eyes were dead, devoid of any warmth or hospitality. Dinner was a masterclass in suffocating silence. We sat at a long, heavy wooden table in a dining room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old dust. We ate dry meatloaf and boiled potatoes. There was no television playing in the background. There was no radio. There was no conversation. The only sounds in the entire room were the scraping of our silverware against the porcelain plates, the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, and the relentless drumming of the freezing rain against the window panes. After dinner, as soon as our plates were cleared, her parents simply turned around and retreated to their master bedroom on the first floor, closing the heavy door behind them with a definitive click. They didn't tell us good night. They didn't tell us to stay out of trouble. They just vanished. Chloe and I spent the rest of the evening hanging out in her bedroom on the second floor. Her room was huge, boasting high ceilings and hardwood floors, but it was strangely, uncomfortably barren. It didn't look like an 11-year-old girl's bedroom. There were no posters of boy bands on the walls. There were no stuffed animals, no piles of clothes, no scattered books. It looked entirely unlived in. It was just a heavy wooden bed frame, a tall antique dresser, and a large bare window looking out over the pitch-black, rain-swept fields. We tried our best to have a normal sleepover. We stayed up until around 1 a.m., sitting cross-legged on the floor, playing round after round of board games we had brought up from the living room. But the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the house was inescapable. Every time the wind howled outside, the entire house seemed to groan and shift in response. Eventually, exhaustion overtook the awkwardness, and we decided to go to sleep.
Chloe climbed into the tall bed, pulling the heavy quilts up to her chin. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the hardwood floor near the open doorway. The door was propped open, looking directly out into the pitch-black, cavernous second-story hallway. The darkness out there was absolute. It looked like a solid wall of black ink. I lay there for a long time, listening to the rain, before finally drifting into a fitful, uneasy sleep. Around 3 a.m., my eyes snapped open.
I walked over to the deep porcelain sink, trying to keep my breathing shallow. I reached out, grabbed a heavy glass tumbler from the plastic drying rack on the counter, and slowly turned on the tap. The pipes shuddered violently, letting out a loud, hollow groan before a stream of freezing, metallic-tasting well water gushed out. I filled the glass to the brim, brought it to my lips, and drank the water down greedily, my eyes slowly adjusting to the dark, shadowy corners of the large room. I pulled the glass away from my mouth, letting out a quiet, satisfied sigh. As I moved to set the empty tumbler back down on the counter, a sudden, subtle movement caught my eye. It was in the reflection of the dark glass of the window situated directly above the sink. Someone was standing in the dining room, just a few feet behind me. My entire body locked up, my muscles seized in a state of absolute, paralyzing terror. My breath hitched in my throat, trapping a pocket of cold air in my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second, praying to every god I could think of that it was just my exhausted brain playing tricks on me in the dark, or that it was just my own shadow cast by the moonlight. I opened my eyes. The reflection was still there. The heavy glass tumbler began to slip slightly in my suddenly slick, sweaty hand. With agonizing slowness, terrified of making a sudden movement, I slowly turned around to face the archway that connected the kitchen to the dining room. Standing dead center in the archway, completely bathed in the shadows, was a woman. She was exceptionally tall and unnervingly gaunt. She was wearing a long, filthy white nightgown made of a thin, gossamer material that was heavily stained with dark, crusty brown patches. The hem of the gown was ragged and dragged heavily on the linoleum floor. Her hair was stringy, greasy, and matted, hanging down in a thick gray curtain over her face, completely obscuring her features from the nose up. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. "It's her mother," I told myself frantically. "It's Mrs. Miller. She's just sleepwalking. People do weird things when they sleepwalk." "Mrs. Miller?" I whispered, my voice trembling so violently it cracked on the second syllable. The woman didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge that I had spoken at all. She just stood perfectly, impossibly still, her head tilted slightly to the side at a broken, inquisitive angle, like a bird inspecting a worm. Then the clouds outside shifted again, and a fresh beam of harsh silver moonlight cut across the kitchen floor, illuminating the lower half of her body. It caught her hands, which were resting limply at her sides. My stomach completely dropped out from under me. A wave of profound, icy nausea washed over me, so intense I thought I was going to vomit right there on the linoleum. Her hands were backward. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't an optical illusion. The anatomy was completely, grotesquely inverted. The backs of her hands were facing her thighs. The palms of her hands were facing outward, away from her body. Her thumbs were pointing awkwardly, sickeningly toward her back. It was physically impossible, a horrific, unnatural distortion of the human form that my brain screamed in primitive rejection. Every single survival instinct I possessed, passed down through millions of human evolution, screamed at me to turn and run, but my legs felt like they had been cast in solid lead. I was completely trapped in the kitchen, the only way back to the foyer, The only way back to the stairs and the safety of Chloe's room was directly past the archway where that impossible thing stood blocking the path. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the woman began to raise her arms. Her joints popped and cracked with a sickening wet sound, like thick branches breaking in a quiet forest. She lifted her arms straight out in front of her. Her backward hands reached out toward me, the palms facing my face, her long, yellowed, cracked nail beds trembling slightly in the air. She didn't take a step. I watched her ragged hemline, waiting for the rise and fall of a footstep, but it never came. Instead, she began to glide forward. Her feet never left the ground. She just moved across the linoleum floor with a terrifyingly smooth, continuous, unnatural motion, like a statue being pushed on a dolly. She closed the distance between the dining room and the kitchen without making a single sound, her head still tilted at that broken angle, her greasy hair swaying slightly, her backward hands reaching out, grasping at the empty air between us. As she crossed the kitchen threshold, the ambient air temperature instantly plummeted. It felt like walking into an industrial meat freezer. I could see my own frantic, shallow breaths pluming in the air in front of my face. And with the cold came the smell. It hit me like a physical blow to the face, a thick, rancid, suffocating stench of rotting meat, copper blood, and deep, stagnant swamp water. It smelled like an open grave. She was only 5 feet away from me now. I could hear the wet, rattling wheeze of her breath behind the curtain of her hair. I couldn't take it anymore. The paralyzing terror broke, snapping into pure, unadulterated panic. My fingers went numb, and I dropped the glass. It hit the hard linoleum floor right at my feet and shattered with a deafening, explosive crash. Shards of heavy glass and freezing water exploded outward in every direction. The sudden, violent noise seemed to break the hypnotic, terrifying spell of her advance. The woman stopped gliding instantly. Her body went completely rigid. Then her head snapped violently upward. The sheer force of the movement threw the thick, greasy curtain of her hair back over her shoulders, finally exposing her face to the moonlight. She had no eyes. There were no sockets. There was no scarring. There was just smooth, unbroken, pale, translucent skin stretching seamlessly from her brow ridge down to her cheekbones. Where her eyes should have been, there was nothing but a blank, horrifying canvas. Her jaw suddenly unhinged, her mouth opened, stretching down impossibly wide, tearing the skin at the corners of her lips, revealing a black, cavernous void. From that impossible maw, she let out a piercing, unearthly, deafening shriek. It didn't sound like a human scream. It sounded like metal tearing, mixed with the sound of a slaughterhouse. It was a frequency so high and so loud that it vibrated violently in my teeth and rattled deep within the cage of my chest. I bolted.
I didn't think, I just reacted. I threw my body weight forward, slipping frantically in the puddle of water and broken glass in my stocking feet. I felt a sharp, slicing pain in my heel, but the adrenaline completely masked it. I scrambled on my hands and knees, scrambling blindly past her. I felt the freezing, rancid air of her gown brush against my shoulder as I blew past her through the archway. I hit the hardwood floor of the foyer and scrambled toward the stairs. I threw myself at the steps, grabbing the wooden banister and hauling myself upward. I slipped, my shins slamming violently against the sharp wooden edges of the stairs. I felt the skin tear and warm blood begin to run down my legs, but I didn't stop. I scrambled up on all fours, sobbing, gasping for air, waiting to feel those impossibly cold, backward hands clamp down on my ankles and drag me back down into the dark. I crested the landing, threw myself down the second-story hallway, and practically dove into Chloe's bedroom. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind me, my hands trembling so violently I could barely grip the brass lock.
I threw the deadbolt with a loud metallic clack. I backed away from the door immediately, scrambling backward until my spine hit the far corner of the room, wedging myself between the wall and the antique dresser. I pulled my knees tight to my chest, wrapped my arms around my legs, and began sobbing hysterically, completely unable to catch my breath. My chest was heaving, my lungs burning, the metallic taste of sheer panic thick on my tongue. The commotion woke Chloe. She sat up slowly in the large bed, the heavy quilts pooling around her waist. She rubbed her eyes sleepily, looking at me huddled in the corner, bleeding on her hardwood floor. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice slightly thick with sleep. "What happened?" "There's someone downstairs," I sobbed, the words tumbling out of my mouth in a frantic, hyperventilating rush. I raised a violently shaking finger and pointed it at the locked wooden door. "There's a woman in the kitchen. Chloe, her eyes. She didn't have any eyes. And her hands. Oh God, her hands are wrong. They're on backwards." I waited for her to scream. I waited for her to jump out of bed, to run to the door, to ask where her parents were, to panic with me. But Chloe didn't look scared. She didn't gasp. She didn't pull the covers up to her chin. Instead, her expression went completely terrifyingly flat. All the grogginess vanished, replaced by the exact same robotic, empty, dead-eyed stare I had seen on her parents' faces in the foyer earlier that evening. It was a look of total, emotionless resignation. She turned her head slowly, looking at the heavy locked door. Then she turned her head back and looked at me, huddled and bleeding in the corner. "Oh," Chloe said softly. Her voice was completely devoid of any emotion, inflection, or fear. It was just a statement of fact. "You saw my grandmother." She reached out and adjusted the quilt over her lap. "She doesn't like visitors." Chloe lay back down, pulled the covers over her shoulder, and turned her back to me. Within 5 minutes, the steady, rhythmic sound of her breathing told me she had gone entirely back to sleep. I did not sleep. I spent the next 4 hours huddled in that freezing corner, my knees pulled to my chest, my eyes wide open, burning in the dark, staring unblinkingly at the brass lock on the bedroom door. The adrenaline slowly faded, leaving me shivering uncontrollably, acutely aware of the throbbing pain in my shins and my heel. About 10 minutes after Chloe fell back asleep, the noises in the hallway started. I heard the heavy, unnatural, gliding footsteps slowly cresting the top of the stairs. I heard the wet, rattling wheeze echoing in the cavernous hall. And then she reached our door. For the rest of the night, until the harsh gray morning light finally began to bleed through the gray clouds outside the window, I sat completely paralyzed in the corner, listening to the sound of those backward hands. Because her hands were inverted, she couldn't knock normally. I listened, tears streaming silently down my face as she pressed the backs of her knuckles against the wood. I listened to the sickening sound of her long, yellowed nails dragging down the face of the door, scratching softly against the wood from the top to the bottom, over and over and over again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Accompanying the scratching was a soft, wet, unintelligible whispering, a continuous muttering from a mouth that shouldn't exist, pressing right against the crack under the door. I didn't move a single muscle until the harsh gray morning light finally filled the room and the noises outside the door had been silent for an hour. When morning broke, I didn't wait for Chloe to wake up. I unlocked the door, my heart in my throat, and sprinted down the hallway. I didn't look at the scratches on the wood. I didn't look toward the kitchen. I ran straight into the living room, picked up the beige landline from the side table, and called my parents. I was crying so hard my mother couldn't understand what I was saying, but she heard the absolute terror in my voice. She was there in 20 minutes. I sat on the front porch in the freezing morning air, ignoring Mr. and Mrs. Miller when they finally emerged from their room and asked me with those same empty smiles if I had a nice time. I didn't say a word. I just got into my mother's car and locked the door. I never spoke to Chloe again. I avoided her in the hallways at school, turning around and walking the other way whenever I saw her pale face. I couldn't look at her without seeing the flat, dead expression she wore when she told me about her grandmother. 2 weeks later, the school counselor announced that Chloe had transferred out of our district. Her family packed up their belongings and moved away from the farmhouse in the middle of the night, without telling anyone, without leaving a forwarding address. The house sat empty for years, rotting away in the Oregon rain. I am in my 30s now. I have a normal life, a normal job, a normal apartment, but I don't know who or what was living in that isolated farmhouse with the Miller family. I don't know why they accepted it, or why they weren't afraid of a thing with no eyes and hands that reached backward into the dark. But I know it wasn't human. I know what I saw in the moonlight, and I know that is the exact reason why 20 years later I still cannot sleep without a heavy lamp burning brightly on my nightstand, illuminating every single corner of my bedroom, terrified of what might be gliding toward me in the pitch black.
When you're a kid, a treehouse represents the ultimate untouchable sanctuary. It's a sovereign nation hovering in the canopy, a place where adult rules, bedtimes, and earthly worries simply do not apply. You were elevated high above the mundane world, sitting in a wooden fortress of your own making. But as I learned in the most horrifying way imaginable, elevation doesn't always equal safety. Sometimes putting yourself high up in the dark, isolated from the safety of the ground, just makes you an easier target for the things that know exactly how to climb. I grew up in the sprawling, heavily wooded suburbs of Seattle in the early 2000s. Our house sat at the very end of a quiet cul-de-sac, and our backyard bled directly into a massive, dense tract of protected Pacific Northwest forest. The trees out there were ancient, towering pines and sprawling oaks that choked out the sunlight and plunged the forest floor into a perpetual, damp twilight. My dad was an avid amateur carpenter. He spent his weekends in the garage covered in sawdust, building bookshelves and coffee tables. But his magnum opus, his absolute pride and joy, was the incredible treehouse he built for me in the massive, ancient oak tree that anchored the back corner of our property line. This wasn't just a few planks of scrap wood nailed to a branch. It was an architectural marvel for a 13-year-old. It was situated a dizzying 15 feet off the ground, built on a heavy, incredibly sturdy platform supported by thick, treated lumber. It had 4 solid walls, a pitched, shingled roof that kept the Seattle rain out, and 2 small, square windows that overlooked the sprawling, dark woods behind our property. Access to the fortress was via a heavy, custom-built wooden ladder, the thick rungs nailed and bolted directly into the massive trunk of the oak. It was mid-August, and the Pacific Northwest was suffering through a rare, stifling heat wave. Our house, like most older homes in the area, was completely non-air conditioned. The second floor was baking, trapping the day's heat like a brick oven. I was 13, suffocating in my bedroom, and after 2 days of relentless begging, my parents finally agreed to let me sleep overnight in the treehouse, where the air might be a little cooler. I was ecstatic. I spent the early evening hauling my survival gear up the ladder. I brought a thick, heavy-duty sleeping bag, a massive, heavy metal Maglite flashlight, a towering stack of worn-out superhero comic books, a few bags of chips, and a cheap battery-powered boombox radio. As the sun went down, casting long orange shadows across the lawn, I sat in the open doorway of my wooden castle, feeling like an absolute king. But by 11:30 p.m., the novelty of independence had entirely worn off.
The heat hadn't broken. The air inside the small wooden box was thick, still, and heavy. My boombox had died around 10, chewing through its cheap D batteries, leaving me in total silence. The woods behind the house, which had seemed like a cool playground in the daylight, had transformed into a towering wall of pitch-black ink. The only sound in the entire world was the deafening, rhythmic chirping of thousands of crickets and the occasional rustle of a warm summer breeze moving through the oak leaves. I was lying flat on my back on top of my sleeping bag, sweating through my t-shirt, reading an old comic book by the harsh yellow beam of my flashlight. Around midnight, the crickets abruptly stopped. It wasn't a gradual fade. It wasn't a slow lessening of the noise. It was an instantaneous, synchronized cessation of sound, exactly as if someone had flipped a master switch on the forest. If you spend enough time outdoors, or if you watch enough nature documentaries, you know that absolute dead silence in a nocturnal environment is a very, very bad sign. It is nature's ultimate alarm bell. It means a predator has entered the immediate area and every living thing has frozen in place, praying they're not the prey. The woods went completely, suffocatingly dead quiet. I slowly lowered my comic book to my chest. My breathing became shallow. I strained my ears, listening intently to the heavy silence, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in my grip. Crunch. A heavy, deliberate footstep broke a dry, dead branch on the forest floor directly below me. The sound echoed in the quiet night. It was incredibly close. It sounded like it was right at the base of the massive oak tree. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the summer heat. I immediately reached up and clicked off my heavy metal flashlight, plunging the interior of the treehouse into absolute darkness. I didn't want whatever was down there to know I was up here. I rolled over onto my stomach, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. I crept silently across the wooden floorboards, moving on my elbows and knees until I reached the small, square window that overlooked the trunk of the tree and the wooden ladder. I pressed my face against the rough wood frame and peered into the gloom. Standing dead center at the base of the tree, illuminated faintly by the ambient silver moonlight filtering through the canopy, was a figure. My brain completely short-circuited trying to process what I was looking at. It was vaguely humanoid, but the proportions were completely horrifyingly wrong. It was incredibly tall, at least 7 feet, maybe taller, but it was far, far too thin. It looked like a stick figure stretched and distorted in a funhouse mirror. It stood perfectly, impossibly still. Its shoulders slumped forward. Its arms were entirely too long, hanging limply at its sides, the hands dangling well past its knees. It was wearing a tattered, filthy, bright yellow rain slicker. The coat looked ancient, covered in dark, greasy stains, the bottom hem shredded into ribbons. The heavy yellow hood was pulled up, completely obscuring its head and face. My breath caught painfully in my throat. I wanted to yell for my dad. His master bedroom window was directly facing the backyard and the treehouse. I could see the faint glow of the streetlights reflecting off his glass, but I was absolutely paralyzed by the terrifying certainty that any noise I made, any scream I let out, would immediately draw the figure's full attention. I watched, holding my breath, as the towering figure slowly, mechanically raised one of those impossibly long, spindly arms. It reached out from beneath the yellow slicker and placed a pale hand on the very first wooden rung of the ladder. It was coming up. I scrambled backward from the window, scraping my knees hard against the wooden floorboards. I pushed myself into the furthest, darkest back corner of the treehouse, wedging my spine against the wood. I huddled under my heavy sleeping bag, pulling it up over my head like a shield, clutching my heavy, solid metal mag-light flashlight in my right hand like a medieval club. Then the auditory torture began. I heard the sickening, agonizing sound of the thick wooden rungs groaning as the massive, concentrated weight of the figure tested the ladder. Creak, the first step. The climbing was excruciatingly slow. It wasn't the fluid, rhythmic hand-over-hand climb of a human being. It was erratic. It was disjointed and uncoordinated, like a puppet being pulled by a drunken master. First, there was a heavy, dead thud as it placed a foot on a rung. Then a long, agonizing pause of total silence. Then a horrific, wet, dragging sound as it hauled its elongated body upward, followed by another violent creak of the wood under stress. Creak, drag, thud. It was a quarter of the way up. My heart was beating so violently against my sternum, I genuinely thought it was going to break my ribs. I couldn't catch my breath. I was hyperventilating, the air turning sour in my lungs. I was completely, hopelessly trapped in a tiny wooden box 15 feet in the air. There was no secondary exit. There was no fire escape. There was just the ladder. Creak, drag, thud. It was halfway up. The entire oak tree seemed to shudder slightly under its ascending weight. Creak, drag, thud. It reached the platform. I squeezed my eyes shut, but I could hear everything with terrifying clarity. I heard the heavy, incredibly wet slapping sound of its bare feet stepping off the ladder and onto the wooden deck of the treehouse platform, standing just inches outside the entryway. The treehouse didn't have a solid wooden door. My dad hadn't gotten around to installing it yet. It just had an open square doorway covered by a heavy piece of green canvas tarp hanging from a wooden dowel to keep the wind out. Through the thin fabric of the canvas, heavily backlit by the bright silver moonlight, I saw its silhouette. Because the figure was so impossibly tall, it couldn't stand up straight on the platform. I watched its shadow warp and bend as it hunched over severely, its spine curving into a grotesque C shape to fit under the overhang of the shingled roofline. Slowly, the edge of the canvas tarp began to move. A hand reached around the fabric. It was pale, sickly white, and unnaturally long. The fingers looked like bleached twigs, ending not in human nails, but thick, dark, talon-like points that clicked sharply against the wooden doorframe. The hand pushed the canvas tarp aside. The figure crawled into the treehouse. Because the doorway was built for children, the 7-foot monstrosity had to drop down onto all fours to get inside. I watched in absolute mind-shattering horror as its impossibly long limbs folded and articulated at sharp, backward, spider-like angles, compressing its massive frame to squeeze through the small square opening. It dragged itself onto the floorboards right in front of me.
Under the heavy, filthy yellow hood of the raincoat, I couldn't see a face. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, and a mouth, there was nothing but a cavernous, pitch-black void that seemed to swallow the ambient light. The moment it breached the room, the smell hit me. It was a physical wall of stench. The air inside the small wooden box instantly smelled like centuries of decaying wet leaves mixed with the sharp, acidic sting of raw sewage and rotting copper. It was so foul, I immediately gagged, bile rising in the back of my throat. It stayed completely on all fours, its knuckles resting on the wood. Then its incredibly long neck began to crane. It slowly, mechanically turned its hooded, faceless head toward the dark back corner, toward me.
I knew in that exact fraction of a second that if I stayed huddled under that sleeping bag, if I froze and waited for it to act, I was going to die in that treehouse. I didn't think about my next move. Conscious thought vanished entirely. Pure, unadulterated, primal survival instinct completely took the wheel. I gripped the cold, knurled aluminum of my heavy metal flashlight. I threw the sleeping bag off me, opened my mouth, and screamed with absolutely every single ounce of air I had left in my burning lungs. A raw, bloody, terrifying shriek of pure defiance. I wound my arm back and threw the heavy metal flashlight directly at the center of the pitch-black void beneath the yellow hood, with all the strength my 13-year-old body could muster. The heavy metal struck the thing squarely in the face with a loud, wet crack. The figure let out a sound I will never forget. It wasn't a yell or a roar. It was a high-pitched, deafening, screeching hiss that sounded exactly like heavy sheet metal being violently torn in half. It threw its long, spindly limbs up to cover its hood, recoiling violently backward toward the doorway, its spider-like limbs scrambling against the wood. I didn't hesitate for a microsecond. I lunged forward, throwing my entire body weight past it. I felt the freezing, wet, greasy fabric of the yellow raincoat brush against my bare arm as I scrambled out the doorway, bursting through the canvas tarp and out onto the exterior wooden platform. I didn't even look for the ladder. I didn't care. I ran to the edge of the wooden platform, grabbed the railing for a split second to orient myself, and just dropped. 15 feet is a terrifying drop in the dark. I felt the rushing wind, the weightlessness, and then I hit the ground. I hit the soft, tilled dirt of my mother's garden bed incredibly hard. The impact shot up my legs. I rolled violently upon landing, hearing a sickening pop as I severely twisted my left ankle and felt the sharp, hot tear of a sprain as I threw my right wrist out to break my fall. But the massive flood of adrenaline completely masked the pain. I didn't even feel it. I scrambled to my feet like a wild animal, tearing through the tomato plants, and sprinted across the dark expanse of our manicured lawn, screaming for my dad at the absolute top of my lungs. Before I even reached the patio, the heavy back porch light flicked on, flooding the yard with harsh yellow light. The back door flew open, and my dad burst out onto the deck. He was in his boxers, clutching a heavy aluminum baseball bat in one hand and a massive police-issue mag light in the other. I crashed into his chest, knocking the wind out of both of us. I was sobbing hysterically, hyperventilating, pointing a shaking, dirt-covered finger back toward the massive oak tree. "There's something up there! Dad, it's in the treehouse!" My dad didn't ask questions. He shoved me behind his back, raised the bat, and clicked on his powerful flashlight, sending a blinding, focused beam of white light cutting across the yard, illuminating the wooden structure high in the branches. The beam swept the platform. It swept the open canvas doorway. The treehouse was completely empty. There was no yellow raincoat. There was no 7-foot figure, just the empty dark. My dad dragged me inside, locked every door in the house, and immediately called 911. 2 squad cars arrived within 10 minutes. The police officers drew their weapons and searched the entire property. They scoured the perimeter, swept the dark woods behind our fence line with high-powered spotlights, and climbed up into the treehouse itself. They found no one. No footprints in the woods, no transient camps, no sign of a trespasser. But they did find 3 very specific things in and around that oak tree that absolutely convinced my skeptical parents and the veteran police officers that I wasn't just having a vivid nightmare. First, the heavy, treated wooden rungs of the ladder, starting from the bottom and working all the way up to the platform. The wood was covered in deep, jagged, gouged claw marks. They were shredded, the splinters hanging off, far too deep and widely spaced to have been made by a human hand, or a bear, or a raccoon. Second, resting perfectly in the center of my crumpled sleeping bag inside the treehouse, the officers found a massive clump of coarse, wiry, dark hair. It didn't look human, and it was completely coated in a thick, foul-smelling black grease that smelled strongly of raw sewage. And finally, lying on the floorboards near the doorway, they found my heavy metal flashlight. The thick aluminum casing was severely dented from the impact, but worse, the entire front half of the flashlight was coated in a thick, viscous, bubbling black fluid that the crime lab technicians couldn't identify. My dad didn't wait for a follow-up investigation. He canceled his weekend plans, went out to the garage, fired up his heavy-duty chainsaw, and spent the next 2 days tearing that magnificent treehouse down to the last splinter. He burned the wood in a massive bonfire in the center of the yard until there was nothing left but ash. We never found out what climbed up that oak tree that hot August night. The police eventually filed it as an unsolved trespassing incident, but the experience fundamentally altered my worldview. I learned a very hard, very valuable lesson that night. When you're a child, your parents tell you that the monsters are hiding under your bed or lurking in the dark corners of your closet. But that's a lie designed to make you feel safe in your own home. The truth is much worse. Sometimes the monsters aren't hiding from you at all. Sometimes they are just waiting patiently for you to leave the safety of the ground and climb up into the dark so they can finally join you.